The first sign that something was wrong was not a sound or a person or even a message. It was a line. A hard, unnatural line cutting across land that had never needed one before. The fence stood there as if it had always belonged. Wooden panels aligned with unsettling precision, each post driven deep into soil that had been quiet and unchanged for years.
You have no right to be here!
It divided the property in a way that felt wrong even before it was fully understood. Not because fences are unusual, but because this one didn't follow the logic of the land.
According to the survey, this fence placement is incorrect.
Fresh earth, uneven compression, and faint machine tracks suggested recent construction. Whoever had placed it did so quickly, efficiently, and without hesitation. There was no sign of hesitation in the placement, no visible attempt to confirm alignment with natural or legal boundaries. It was decisive, almost aggressive in its certainty. And that certainty was the first problem. Because the land had always been defined. Not casually, not loosely, but through official records, surveys, and established property lines that had never been in question. Nothing about those documents suggested a division at this point. Nothing supported a structure cutting through it. And yet, here it was, solid, real, and physically altering the space. The contradiction between record and reality created immediate tension. At first glance, it might have seemed like a simple misunderstanding. Boundaries can be misread. Maps can be outdated. Even experienced systems can make errors when relying on incomplete information. But something about this situation resisted that explanation. The placement of the fence was too deliberate, too confident. It did not feel like a mistake. It felt like a decision. And decisions carry responsibility. As the view of the fence extended across the land, it became clear that this was not a small adjustment. It was a full interruption of continuity. A straight barrier where there had always been openness. It didn't just mark space, it changed how that space could be used, seen, and understood. The question became unavoidable: who had authorized this? Because fences do not appear without action. Materials must be ordered, labor must be arranged, and placement must be approved. Even within community governance structures like an HOA, there are supposed to be limits. Defined areas of control. Clear distinctions between shared responsibility and private ownership. This fence crossed into territory where those distinctions mattered more than ever. The realization did not arrive all at once. It built gradually, layer by layer, as observation gave way to analysis. The more it was examined, the more the structure felt out of place. Not just physically, but procedurally. It had the appearance of authority without the foundation of it. And that created a deeper concern. Because if this could happen here, without warning or explanation, then something within the system that governed the property had shifted. Whether through misunderstanding or overreach, the result was the same: a physical alteration of space that did not match documented reality. The fence stood quietly, but it carried weight. Not just as wooden nails, but as evidence that something had moved beyond its proper boundary. And once that understanding formed, the situation could not be seen the same way again. It was no longer just a fence. It was a question waiting for an answer. To understand how the fence came to exist, it was necessary to step back from the moment itself and look at the structure surrounding it. The HOA had always operated in the background of the property, functioning as a governing body for shared standards, maintenance rules, and community organization. Its presence was known, but its influence was generally confined. That was the expectation, at least. In practice, systems like this rely heavily on interpretation. Rules are written, but application depends on people. And people rely on information, maps, records, past decisions, and institutional memory. When that information is accurate, the system functions smoothly. When it is not, errors can quietly become actions. The fence suggested such a breakdown. Because no properly verified boundary should result in construction across clearly defined private land. That meant somewhere along the line, either the data was wrong, or the interpretation of that data was flawed. Perhaps outdated records had been used. Perhaps assumptions were made based on neighboring layouts or historical misunderstandings. Or perhaps authority had simply been extended further than it should have been. None of those possibilities were comforting, but all of them were plausible within a system that lacked immediate external correction. The property itself, however, did not support ambiguity. Its boundaries had been established long before the current situation, documented through official surveys that defined exact measurements and coordinates. These records were not informal suggestions, they were legal definitions of space. They existed independently of perception or opinion. And those records did not match the placement of the fence. That mismatch became the center of the issue. Because once physical reality and documented reality diverge, one of them must be wrong. And in structured property systems, documentation is supposed to be the anchor. It is the reference point that prevents confusion, disputes, and unauthorized changes. The presence of the fence indicated that this anchor had been ignored or misunderstood. Within the HOA structure, decisions often pass through layers of approval and interpretation. Committees, inspections, reports, all of these contribute to final outcomes. But each layer introduces the possibility of error. A misread map. A misfiled document. A verbal assumption that replaces written verification. Over time, these small deviations can accumulate. Until something like this happens. The fence was not just a physical object. It was the result of a chain of decisions, each one dependent on the accuracy of the previous one. If any link in that chain was flawed, the final outcome would reflect that flaw. And here, the outcome was undeniable. A structure placed where it should not exist. This raised a deeper concern about authority. Because authority is only valid when it aligns with accurate information. Without that alignment, action becomes overreach, even if it was intended as routine governance. The HOA likely believed it was acting correctly. That belief may have been based on incomplete or misinterpreted information, but belief alone does not establish correctness. And when belief overrides verification, systems begin to fail in subtle but significant ways. The fence represented that failure. Not dramatically, but clearly. And now, the task was no longer just to observe it, but to understand how such a decision could have been made in the first place. Beyond the technical and procedural questions, there was something else that emerged as the fence remained in place, a shift in perception. The land no longer felt continuous. Where there had once been openness, there was now division. Not just physical separation, but psychological interruption. The simple act of looking across the property now carried a reminder that something had changed without consent or explanation. That change carried emotional weight. Because land is not only defined by documents and measurements. It is also defined by experience. Familiarity builds a sense of stability, and stability creates trust. When that trust is disrupted, even visually, it creates discomfort that cannot be ignored. The fence disrupted that trust. Every detail reinforced the feeling that something had been imposed rather than agreed upon. The straightness of the panels, the firmness of the posts, the absence of communication, all of it contributed to a growing sense that control over the space had been challenged. And that challenge could not remain unanswered. What made the situation more complex was that there was no immediate confrontation, no direct explanation, no visible acknowledgement of the disruption. The fence simply existed, as if its presence alone was enough to justify itself. But justification requires alignment with truth. And truth was now in question. This uncertainty began to shift the focus from reaction to understanding. Emotional response alone could not resolve the situation. There needed to be clarity. Not assumptions, not interpretations, but verified information that could confirm what was real and what was not. Because without clarity, uncertainty spreads. And once uncertainty spreads, it becomes harder to distinguish error from intent. The land, in its unchanged portions, served as a reminder of what had been interrupted. The continuity that once defined it was still visible in areas untouched by the fence. That contrast made the disruption more obvious, more difficult to ignore. It also made resolution feel necessary. Not optional. Necessary. The presence of the fence had created a division, but it had also created a direction. It pointed toward investigation, toward documentation, toward something that could restore understanding. And that understanding would have to come from beyond perception. It would have to come from records, from surveys, from established truth that existed independently of the structure now standing in the way. Because only that level of clarity could resolve what had been broken. Until then, the fence remained not just a structure, but a question that demanded an answer. The situation did not remain quiet for long. What had begun as a single fence on private land slowly transformed into something larger once the implications became impossible to ignore. The structure itself had not changed, but the awareness around it had expanded. What once felt like a personal disruption now carried the weight of procedural conflict and authority questioning. Because once boundaries are crossed, literally and administratively, the issue stops being private. It becomes systemic. The first step was understanding the documentation. The property records that defined the land were not vague or interpretive. They were precise, structured through surveys that measured every edge and corner. These documents existed independently of opinion, forming the legal foundation of ownership. And when those documents were compared against the physical placement of the fence, the contradiction became undeniable. The fence did not align. Not slightly. Not debatably. It diverged in a way that suggested the original placement decision had not been verified against official data. That meant the action was not just questionable, it was unsupported by the very system meant to prevent such errors. This realization shifted the tone of the entire situation. Because now, it was no longer about a misunderstanding between neighbors or a small administrative oversight. It was about the failure of verification within a governing structure that was supposed to ensure accuracy before physical changes occurred. The HOA, as an organization, relied on documentation, approvals, and procedural steps. But somewhere within that chain, something had gone unchecked. Whether through outdated maps, miscommunication, or assumption, the result was the same, a physical structure placed in contradiction to recorded fact. And contradictions demand resolution. The presence of the fence had become more than a boundary issue. It had turned into a test of accountability. A question of how decisions were made, and how those decisions were allowed to translate into physical reality without proper confirmation. As the matter escalated internally, the pressure increased not through confrontation, but through evidence. The more documentation was reviewed, the clearer the discrepancy became. Each record reinforced the same conclusion: the fence had no valid alignment with the established boundary. This created a point of tension within the system itself. Because once evidence is clear, it cannot be ignored indefinitely without consequence. Systems depend on consistency. And when consistency breaks, correction becomes necessary. The fence, which once stood as a symbol of authority or control, now represented something else entirely. It represented an action taken beyond verified limits. And that distinction mattered. Because authority is only valid when it is grounded in accuracy. Without accuracy, authority becomes assumption. And assumption, when acted upon physically, creates disruption. That disruption was now visible in the land itself. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. It was how it had been allowed to happen in the first place. And that question began to extend beyond the property line. The turning point came not through confrontation, but through documentation. As the records were examined more deeply, a critical detail emerged, one that clarified the entire situation in a way that left no room for interpretation. The original survey documents, those that defined the legal boundaries of the property, were consistent and unambiguous. They showed the land in its true, established form, long before any HOA-related decisions were made regarding nearby development or organization. And those documents did not support the fence's position in any way. The placement of the structure was not a minor deviation. It was a direct encroachment into privately defined space. The measurements were clear, the coordinates precise, and the legal descriptions consistent across multiple verified records. There was no ambiguity. This meant the fence was not the result of a questionable interpretation of shared space or an outdated map reference. It was a misapplication of authority based on incorrect or incomplete understanding of the property's actual boundaries. That realization changed everything. Because once the truth of the boundary was confirmed, the fence could no longer be viewed as a valid structure within the system that authorized it. It became evidence of procedural failure. The implications were significant. Within any structured governing system, actions must be supported by accurate data. When that data is incorrect, the resulting actions lose legitimacy. And when legitimacy is lost, correction is not optional, it is required. The HOA's assumption had created a physical outcome that contradicted established fact. Whether that assumption came from outdated materials, internal miscommunication, or simple oversight did not change the outcome. The outcome itself was incorrect. And incorrect outcomes in physical space have consequences. As this understanding solidified, the focus shifted from questioning intent to addressing correction. Because intent, while relevant, does not override documentation. The land had always been defined clearly, and that clarity had never changed. Only the interpretation of it had. The fence, once seen as a decisive action, now stood as a correction that needed to be undone. Not because of conflict, but because of accuracy. And accuracy, once established, has a way of asserting itself. Quietly, but firmly. The revelation was not dramatic. It did not come with confrontation or sudden collapse of authority. Instead, it came through alignment, through the recognition that what had been done did not match what was recorded. And that mismatch could not remain. Resolution did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, as clarity replaced uncertainty and documentation replaced assumption. Once the boundary verification was complete and the discrepancy fully acknowledged, the situation reached a point where continuation was no longer possible. The fence, which had once stood as a physical assertion of control or structure, no longer aligned with the established truth of the property. And when structure and truth diverge, structure must adjust. The correction process followed. The fence was removed, not as a gesture of conflict resolution, but as a necessary realignment with documented reality. The land itself had never changed. Its boundaries had always been fixed, defined long before the current misunderstanding occurred. What changed was the recognition of those boundaries. And recognition, once corrected, restores order. As the structure came down, the land returned to its uninterrupted state. The continuity that had been disrupted was restored, not through force, but through verification. The physical space was once again aligned with its legal definition. But the impact of the situation extended beyond the physical correction. It revealed something important about systems that rely on layered interpretation. Even well-structured organizations can reach incorrect conclusions when assumptions replace verification. And when those conclusions are acted upon physically, the consequences become visible in ways that cannot be ignored. The fence had been a symptom of that process. Not intentional wrongdoing, but procedural failure. And that distinction matters. Because systems are not judged solely by outcomes, but by how those outcomes are reached. In this case, the outcome had been incorrect, but the correction reaffirmed the importance of documentation, verification, and adherence to established records. The land itself, unchanged throughout the entire process, became a quiet reminder of stability. It had always known its boundaries. It had not moved, shifted, or expanded. Only perception had changed temporarily. And now, that perception had been corrected. The experience left behind a broader understanding, that clarity is not optional in systems that govern physical space. It is essential. Without it, decisions drift into assumption. And assumption, when acted upon, creates disruption. But disruption is not permanent when truth is available. Once truth is applied, balance returns. The fence was gone. The boundary remained. And the land returned to what it had always been, defined, stable, and correctly understood.